Thank you for coming to this session of the Indonesia study group, which obviously is at a very unusual time. Usually it's 12:30 on Wednesdays, but because our special guest here, Sidney Jones, she has been in high demand as usual in Canberra, so we had to schedule it for today. As you know, Sidney, for the last decade or so, has been working with the International Crisis Group, ICG. In fact, she has become the embodiment of that organization in Indonesia. So a lot of you will know her as the senior analyst for that organization. But you are witnessing a very historic moment. This will be the last presentation, the last performance that Sidney will give as a representative of the ICG. She'll be moving on to other things, bigger things, greater things, and maybe we'll see Sidney Jones Institute or something from that. Who knows? But yes, so she will step down from the ICG next month. So this is the last time we'll see her here at the ANU speaking for the ICG, which is very unfortunate for the ICG, but so today she will not talk about Indonesian terrorism and Jemaah Islamiyah or other terrorist networks. She will talk about Aceh and how Aceh became a one-party state and why it matters. Please,
Thank you. Yeah, I was going to call this talk The Collapse of ICG and Why It Matters. So I decided to change it. And I should say at the outset that this is a completely objective, unbiased talk, and I have no problem with any of the parties in Aceh whatsoever. So let's have the next slide. I've been watching as, and all of us have actually, as in the aftermath of the successful conclusion of the peace agreements, how one faction of GAM, which formed a political party, i.e. Partai Aceh, has gradually amassed power so that it now controls the legislative and executive branches of the provincial government, of many of the district governments, of the local election commission, of the civil service, and of a number of other institutions in Aceh. And the question is, should we be at all worried, either intrinsically or for the peace process, about the kind of control it now exerts? And I think to understand this, we should go back just a little bit and look at how Partai Aceh got to the point that it is now in Aceh. This was the most contentious part of the Helsinki Agreement in 2005, that Aceh be allowed to have local parties and not simply national ones. It was the point that nearly torpedoed the talks in Helsinki because the government was very uneasy about the idea of having local political parties and what it might mean for other parts of Indonesia. But in the end, there was a provision in the Helsinki Agreement that local parties would be allowed to be established. And then in the law that enshrined the peace agreement, usually called LOGA, the law governing Aceh, we also had a provision so that from 2006 onwards, Aceh was legally enabled to establish its own political parties, although it took a while to get going. Next slide. And we also had, in the aftermath of the peace agreement, an institution which was formed to deal with the ex-combatants. And in effect, this organization, called the KPA, effectively replicated the GAM command structure, the military structure. So we had in peacetime effectively the same structure as the Acehese National Army, except this was supposed to be a transition committee to enable the demobilization and reintegration of commanders and fighters in Aceh. It was called the Aceh Transition Committee. To this day, it still exists and is expanding, and the question is transition from what to what. But nevertheless, it is a very important structure, and this becomes part of the story about how Partai Aceh amassed control. And then during the elections, this is Robert Cribb's slide that I pinched, during the elections in 2006, which were the first elections after the peace agreement, and they were elections for governor, and the party was not yet formed, we had elections throughout Aceh in which any GAM individual could run as an independent. And we also had a split emerging for the first time in an election between the old diaspora part of GAM that was based in Sweden, which eventually ended up becoming Partei Aceh, and some of the field-based commanders led by Irwandi, and as we know, Irwandi was elected governor. And if you see the percentages here, you can see how many people in different provinces voted for the winning ticket of Irwandi. But you have to remember that this was a split vote, so even in 2006, we were talking about some people voting for a GAM ticket supported by Sweden, which supported another slate of candidates, as well as Irwandi, who actually won. And if you take the two GAM tickets, basically, that were running in Aceh, you already have over 50% of the vote in 2006. And we also had district elections in 2006. The stars are the districts that voted for GAM candidates there. So even then, immediately afterward, in the immediate aftermath of the peace agreement, we had the Achenese heartland already under GAM control, although not necessarily supporting the Sweden-based diaspora. Next slide. And then we moved to 2007 and 2008 when Partei Aceh was actually formed for the first time. Initially, the faction that was led by the former Prime Minister of GAM, Malik Mahmoud, whose name comes up repeatedly, and who was the signatory for the Achenese side in the Helsinki talks. Initially, he wanted to call the party Partei GAM. And he wanted to have the flag of the GAM movement be the flag of the party. And this was rejected at the time by the Ministry of Home Affairs, and they said, you have to spell out the acronym. So he said, okay, we won't call ourselves Gerakan Aceh Merdeka, we'll call ourselves Gerakan Aceh Mandiri, and we'll still be Partei GAM. And that also was rejected by the Ministry of Home Affairs. So the compromise they came up with was to call themselves Partei Aceh, and instead of having the GAM flag, they changed it to this, which was basically taking the star and crescent out of the original GAM flag, putting in the word Aceh, and keeping the same colors and stripes and so on. So everybody recognized it as a GAM flag. And it registered as a political party, so it was ready to contest the elections in 2009. Then in 2009, we have Malik Mahmoud, who's the founder of the party, actually taking a very prominent role behind the scenes, and Partei Aceh emerging as a contestant in elections for the first time, in which it just romped home in terms of getting more seats than any of the other parties, more than any of the national parties. There were 6 local parties contesting those elections, and Partei Aceh was the dominant one. Most importantly, in terms of future relations with Jakarta, Partei Aceh got out its machine in a way that produced North Korea-like figures for support for Budiono. 92.3% of Aceh voted for SDY in 2009. And they used that organization of former military commanders, known as the KPA, as the crux of the political machine to try and get out the vote. The KPA was divided in 2009. Not every one of its members was supporting Partei Aceh, but nevertheless, as an institution, it was a very important part of the effort to get out the vote. Not only that, but in the effort to raise money for Partei Aceh for the 2009 elections, many of the former commanders who, as Ed has written about, were involved in contracting organizations, were submitting a percentage of their earnings to provide the funding for the political machine that helped get out the vote in 2009. So this was critical to establishing Partei Aceh as a political machine. And as we see, it did extremely well, to the point where in the provincial parliament, it won 33 out of 69 seats, but then combined with a couple of other parties to put together a 42-seat faction in the parliament that could effectively get anything it wanted passed in the Aceh provincial legislature. Then we moved to the election that was for governor that took place in April last year. And again, Partai Aceh's vote getting power was demonstrated. This was, and also its strong-arm tactics, because this was an election in which Irwandi, the incumbent governor, who was on the outs with Partai Aceh, was running against a Partai Aceh ticket. And one of the things that Partai Aceh was fearful about was that it would not be able to win the elections if Irwandi was able to use the office of governor to actually campaign for re-election. So what do? They start trying to create trouble in Aceh to say that the elections, that the security conditions in Aceh are not conducive to holding an election, forcing the government to delay the election until Irwandi had left office and could no longer have the excuse that he could use the resources. Also, Irwandi was planning to run as an independent again in Aceh, and the Partai Aceh said, because it was fearful that Irwandi might win, the Helsinki Agreement suggests that you only can have independent candidates up to the point where you actually have a local party. Once you have a local party, independent candidates are no longer allowed. And that's actually not what the Helsinki Agreement said, but it was an argument that led Partai Aceh to say, if there are independent candidates, we are going to boycott the election. And Jakarta, in particularly the Ministry of Home Affairs, but also Yudhoyono himself, both were so fearful that if Partai Aceh did not compete in the election or continued to boycott the election, that there somehow would be a return to conflict, that it actually did everything it could to accede to Partai Aceh's demands, including turning a blind eye to some of the violence that was going on. So they were successful in getting the delay of the elections. The elections were finally held, and the Partai Aceh candidate, Zaini, who had been the foreign minister of GAM when they were based in Sweden, and the former military commander of Aceh in the field here, Muzaffar Manaf, were elected as the ticket. So what we got as a result was the complete domination of the provincial government, now with the governor of Aceh, the vice governor of Aceh, and the legislature now controlled by GAM. So you've got a stranglehold on the provincial government, and you also have the star districts in Partai Aceh's control. And as you can see, it's all the most populous districts of Aceh. The Green Star in PD Jaya was not a GAM candidate, was not a Partai Aceh candidate, but was backed by Partai Aceh. So you effectively have 11 of the most populous and richest parts of Aceh being under Partai Aceh control. The big exception is Banda Aceh, where you had Partai Demokrat in control. But again, a real tight control, and in all of these starred provinces, it's both the executive and legislative branches that are in control. But you also have increasingly this interlocking directorate, because Muzaffar Manaf is simultaneously head of the KPA, this military, quasi-military organization. He's chairman of the Partai Aceh, and then when he gets elected, he's also deputy governor. So you have this incredibly powerful interlocking directorate just in that one person. And not to mention the money that comes from access to contracts and other goodies from the spoils of governorship. Now, you take also another part of the interlocking directorate, which is Malik Mahmoud. Again, this is the guy who signed the peace agreement on behalf of GAM in Helsinki. He's the founder of Partai Aceh, even though he has no official position. But he also becomes informally, after the 2009 elections, and formally as of November last year, the Wali Nangro. What's the Wali Nangro? It's an institution that was enshrined in the Helsinki Agreement and then in the law, the 2006 law, as effectively the new Sultan of Aceh. It was a position created for Hassan Datiro, the founder of GAM. Hassan Datiro considered himself the 8th generation of basically Achenese sultans, Chik Datiro and all the historical figures of Aceh and so on. His son, Hassan Datiro's son, is actually a professor of early American history at a small little university in Ohio and had no interest in being the crown prince, despite efforts to bring him in. So it was clear that if there was going to be a non-hereditary descendant of Hassan Datiro, it was going to be from that former GAM diaspora, and Malik Mahmud was the most senior. When they were talking about establishing the Wali Nangro, they were looking around for models, and what they wanted was a constitutional monarch with powers like a constitutional monarch in Malaysia, which they went for a study group to look at Malaysian kings, like Denmark, where they went to look at the constitutional monarchs, like Norway, where they went to look at constitutional monarchs, and so on. And what they really wanted was someone who had the power to trump the governor. So just in case Partai Aceh was not in control of the governorship, the Wali Nangro would be a person who would have the authority to disband parliament and to veto gubernatorial decisions. In fact, this was ruled out very early on by Jakarta. And what Jakarta allowed this office to be was a guardian of traditional values and customary rights, adat, in Aceh. So in a way, if you look at Jakarta's concept of this position in the law on governing Aceh, or even in the Helsinki Agreement, it looks very much like the Papuan People's Council, the MRP in Papua, in a kind of advisory role, cultural, not threatening, not political, and so on. Well, with Malik Mahmud, first of all, even when he was in this role informally after Hassan Datiro's death, he was at every major important meeting where there was some agreement to be signed. And they also built this thing that looks like a giant White House in Banda Aceh, which is the new palace of the Wali Nangro. More importantly, when they passed a local regulation at the end of 2011 from the Aceh Parliament, Partai Aceh control, setting up the duties and functions of this particular institution, what they have is an individual, Malik Mahmud, the 9th Wali Nangro of Aceh, and a complete cabinet and bureaucracy, including not a minister, but an advisor for mines, health, education, economics. They even have a special security unit to guard the Wali Nangro, as well as a gigantic budget. Now, every piece of local regulation has to be in accordance with national law and be signed off on in some ways by the, or at least has the potential to be revoked by the Minister of Home Affairs if it's not in accordance with national law. The only things that they really found objectionable or that they found violated national law in this kanun, in this local regulation, was a suggestion that he would have his own ability to make international contacts and so on. So it was his diplomatic role as envisioned in this regulation that Jakarta had problems with. But the fact that he had a complete shadow government with all of these alternative ministries which completely paralleled the local dinas structure in Aceh, at least so far, there hasn't been any word from Jakarta about. From the beginning as well, this was a contentious post because he was so clearly, Malik Mahmud himself, was so clearly a representative of the party as well. And Achenese who saw themselves as not being linked to GOM, saw this as a particularly problematic position because theoretically this was supposed to be a position representing all of Aceh. In fact, it seemed to represent Parte Aceh more than any other part of the province. So we then see, after Parte Aceh takes control of the provincial government and the Wali Nangro, that there begins to be a consolidation in a number of different ways. First of all, you see, even at a district level, that as far as Parte Aceh is concerned, there is no difference between the local legislative party structure, the KPA, and Parte Aceh more generally. It's all part of the same machine as far as they're concerned. Secondly, we also see that they begin to move on taking over the Independent Election Commission in Aceh, because who has to approve the selection of members of the Independent Electoral Commission in Aceh? Parte Aceh, or at least the provincial parliament, which is controlled by Parte Aceh. Therefore, anybody that Parte Aceh doesn't like is not going to get approved as a member of the local Independent Election Commission. And then we also have a gradual displacement of the civil service down to echelon 4 by Parte Aceh, so that at least at the provincial level, members sympathetic to the Parte are being brought in. So we've gradually established control in a way that is unprecedented, I think not just in Aceh, but I think in most other provinces of Indonesia. Now, Aceh has a right to be different, and maybe this is one of the differences. Then, in the middle of all this, as power is being amassed at a provincial level, this issue of the flag comes up. Because from the beginning, what Parte Aceh was more concerned about than any issue of social services or governance or anything else was ensuring that important political symbols of Aceh were recognized. In some ways, their vision of autonomy was centered around being able to control symbols in the beginning before moving on to other things. And one of the key symbols was the flag, because in the Helsinki Agreement, it states that Aceh shall have the right to select its own flag, symbol, and anthem. In the minds of some of the people drafting those provisions, read national flag, national symbol, national anthem, except not at a national level. So what do? In March, they pass a local regulation that the old GOM flag will now be the flag that represents the province. The flag with the crescent and the star and the stripes and everything else. And Jakarta goes ballistic, except being Jakarta in a very Hollywood way. The interesting thing is that after Parte Aceh had tried to register the name Parte GOM and the GOM flag in 2007, when they were first setting up the local party, what happened was that as a way of ensuring that this would never happen again, the government passed a regulation, Peraturan Pemerintah number 77 in 2007, making it illegal to use any separatist symbols in the country more generally, applying both to the old GOM flag as well as to Papuan flag. It never said that the GOM flag specifically was separatist, but it banned separatist symbols, including in Aceh. And the Department of Home Affairs, the Ministry of Home Affairs, said when this local regulation was passed that this was in violation of national law because it violated this provision from 1977, this regulation banning separatist symbols. GOM says, how can we be separatist? We signed an agreement with the Indonesian government. We recognize the sovereignty of NKRI. How can we possibly be considered a separatist movement? Therefore, our old flag, which is, yes, the GOM flag, can't be a separatist symbol because we're no longer separatists. More importantly, they also said, we're supposed to be an autonomous province. If we don't even have the power to decide what our own flag is, what therefore is the meaning of autonomy? But Jakarta is thinking not just this is an indication that Partey Aceh may be getting out of control and using old separatist symbols, they're also thinking, what about Papua? Look at all the people who are arrested in Papua for raising the flag. What will happen there if we allow the separatist flag for Aceh to fly? What does that mean for Papua more generally? Also, there are a lot of people in the government who are still convinced that GAM, more generally, Partey Aceh in particular, is going to work, still interested in working for independence via democratic means. And it's clear that if the flag was approved, that this would be used by Partey Aceh for the 2014 elections and would be used in a highly emotional way to rally the troops and get more support than ever. So this was the stalemate. There have been a lot of meetings back and forth between Jakarta, Ministry of Home Affairs, and the leaders of Partey Aceh. Again, the Wali Nangro, Malik Mahmud, even though he has no official role in the party, is always several steps ahead of the governor, who's always walking behind here, Mr. Zaini. The relations, this looks like a lovely cordial meeting of old friends between Gamawan Fauzi and Zaini Abdullah. In fact, they are completely at opposite ends of the spectrum. There's so far no agreement. The Ministry of Home Affairs has demanded 13 changes in the law, in this regulation allowing the flag to be flown. Partey Aceh has agreed to 2 minor ones, or at least the government structure, but they're still as far apart as ever, and they have no intention, Partey Aceh, of conceding on the flag issue. One of the reasons they have no intentions of conceding is because when they were involved in this election debate over whether the elections for governor would be postponed or not in 2012, they just were completely obstinate, held their grounds, and eventually Jakarta conceded. So this time, they think they conceded the last time. If we hold out, we'll be able to get them to concede again. And Gamawan Fauzi is saying, just change it a little bit. Give us something so we don't lose face. Just take out one of those stripes. You can keep everything else. Just take out a stripe and it won't be the same as the GAM flag. Partey Aceh is saying, no, it's got to be the same. In the meantime, we're seeing lots of other suggestions for flags. Next slide. Oh, sorry, another that's next. Once this flag was proposed, it immediately created 2 kinds of opposition. One was from Achenese, especially non-ethnic Achenese in Aceh, especially the Gayo people, who said this flag represents ethnic Achenese. It represents a movement that is the Achenese heartland. It doesn't represent large swaths of Aceh that are not now and never were part of the GAM structure. And what it did in one fell swoop was to revive a campaign that had died down for the division of Aceh into 3 separate provinces. One, a largely Gayo area that is called Aceh Loiser Antara, or Ala, and then another area along the southwest, which the campaigners for that province want to call Abbas. And we had demonstrations in these 2 areas, but I don't think they were completely spontaneous, because what happened before is that divisions of a province, whether in Aceh or in Papua, were also kind of encouraged by intelligence as a way of divide and rule tactics, an old tactic that's been successful. There was always strong local support in the Gayo areas for a separate province. This area was more contrived, but one of the things that we could see if this issue is not resolved, especially as we move toward the 2014 election, is more deliberate support from intelligence agencies for creating more of those divisions. Next slide. These were actually reversed, but this gives you some idea of some of the alternative flags being proposed by Jakarta and by some other Achenese. Now they say take out the stripes and put in a sword, or make the star. Take out the stripes and make it a 10-point or an 8-pointed star rather than a 5-pointed star. This is the existing flag of Aceh, which is the most ugly flag you ever saw, and looks like every other province's flag in Aceh. This looks like 2 cricket bats and a ball. It's actually 2 crossed swords. And this is some old historical flag with a lot of Arab calligraphy in the middle. In fact, none of them have the emotive power of the Ghan flag, and there's no way that Partey Aceh is going to be interested in any of these. And it's not just the flag issue, because what we have now is the capacity of the provincial legislature to enact any qanun it wants. Now, some of these can create problems for Jakarta. Some of these will be opposed by Jakarta. But basically, any agenda that Partey Aceh wants to set, it can probably get the legislation through, at least initially. And one of the things that it's moving toward is enacting a regulation on setting up a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Now, to be frank, even though there is a provision in the Helsinki Agreement and LOGA for a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Partey Aceh had no real interest in this. It was never something that they were campaigning about in any kind of broad, deeply seated way. But now they see it as a way of tweaking Jakarta and of exerting additional pressure on Jakarta, sort of, if you don't give us the flag, we're going to set up this commission that will bring out all of the concerns about past abuses on the part of the military. Because believe me, if it's a Partey Aceh influenced Truth and Reconciliation Commission, there's not going to be that much information on government abuses in the issue. And also, to be fair, the scale of military abuses was much greater. But anyway, there wasn't really strong Partey Aceh backing of an NGO civil society-based movement for a Truth and Reconciliation Commission and looking back at past abuses until the Ministry of Home Affairs rejected the flag. And now this is a way of kind of pushing them a little bit. But also, what could they do? It's worth thinking through. What could they pass that would be something that is is not out of the realm of possibility that they would have an interest in, that would really cause Jakarta to be concerned? And one of them is if they went forward somehow with, and this is just hypothetical, there's no reason to believe they're actually going to do this, but with arming a security force for the Wali Nango, for example. They have a bodyguard force that's actually built into the law. There's nothing that says it's armed or anything. But if they tried to turn this into something more, I mean, that's the kind of thing that could get Jakarta quite upset. So the only restrictions on what Partey Aceh is interested in passing are its own limited imagination, its desire to stay in power, and its desire, frankly, for more resources. Nobody in this party, as far as I'm concerned, has any interest in going back to conflict. That's not part of the equation. But the question is, now that they've amassed all of this power, what can they do with it, and how will that increase tensions with Jakarta? And again, they're interested, if you look at how they're allocating funds now, there are huge amounts being allocated to their own institutions, including the KPA. And at the same time, there's very little evidence that any of this power is being used to improve basic welfare in Aceh. Indeed, the economic indicators in Aceh are going down. And we still have Aceh, despite all of the wealth that it's generated, being one of the poorest provinces in the country. And the 2013 statistics were that it still ranks 29 out of 33 in the province more generally, in the country more generally. So, I think one of the reasons we should be concerned about the one-party state is the law of unintended consequences. Because I think that if, for example, as we move toward the 2014 elections, we began to see more support for these non-ethnic areas of Aceh to split off and form their own province, which is the kind of Jakarta's counterweight to the if Aceh and Partey Aceh remain obstinate. That's where we can begin to see localized conflict emerge. Again, no chance of a re-eruption of the piece of state versus insurgent conflict, but there are ways in which this tension between Jakarta and the province can get out of hand. There also, as you know from looking at other issues in Indonesia, there's no institutionalized way that Jakarta has for dealing with defiant officials. We've seen local officials defy the federal government, the central government, time after time after time. There's no real effective response, except through some kind of covert action. The other thing is that in other areas, and in Aceh as well, at other times, Jakarta has used radical Islamic networks as an answer to separatism. We saw this in Ambon, we've seen it in some other areas. They should know by now it's playing with fire, but the number of radical organizations who came into Aceh after the tsunami is very prominent. And I know from talking to some of them that there are close relations with military sources in Aceh. Now this is a much less likely strategy to be used in a more systematic basis than this idea of dividing Aceh and supporting the division of Allah and Abbas. But I think there are a number of other factors. I think that one of the issues is what does the power that Partai Aceh has now, what impact does that have on making Jakarta less likely to think about local parties anywhere else? It's whether or not the control of Partai Aceh could lead to a decline in civil liberties for the Acehnese more generally. It's already one of the most dangerous places in Indonesia to be a journalist, for example. What happens if we have a continued deterioration of governance because of the lack of checks and balances in Aceh more generally as the Partai Aceh elite grows stronger? And is there a point at which the defiance of Partai Aceh toward Jakarta reaches critical levels and somebody decides that negotiations were a mistake? We already have people saying now that the reasons we can never have dialogue with Papua are because it's clear that we made too many concessions on Aceh and that this was a bad idea. So we can open it up to questions now.
Thank you very much. Perfect timing too. So I open the floor for questions. Ross McLeod.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sidney, for a wonderful presentation as always. A couple of comments. One thing that strikes me is that these guys having fought this Suharto for so many years, it seems to me they've learned a lot from him and they're trying to follow in his footsteps by pretty much setting up a political monopoly. And they want to control everything, which is what he did, and then you get very rich to do that. So that's a sad outcome, I guess. I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about money. You mentioned that the Wali Nabu has a gigantic budget. Question number one is, where does it come from? And sort of related to that, following decentralization in Indonesia, all the money that flows from the central government basically goes down to district level, Kabupaten Kota, in everywhere else in Indonesia. But I get the impression that, and that was to deliberately bypass the provincial level so that the provinces would be weak and couldn't sort of thumb their nose at Jakarta or worse. Am I right in guessing that most of the money from Jakarta comes to province level now rather than to the Dua? And if that's the case, then how much scope does Jakarta have for just changing that? I mean, you worry about how it's going to control these folks in Aceh. Surely money is the answer. The money comes from Jakarta.
Yeah.
Without the money, the people in Aceh are not strong.
Yeah. The money, most of the money comes from the provincial budget with the additional funds for special autonomy. And if I'm not wrong, the special autonomy funds are to flow for 25 years. Is that right? 20 years, but then there's an additional 5 years at a reduced rate with money coming in. As I understand, I think it was a 60-40 provincial Kabupaten division under Irwandi, and I think it's been 40-60, and I think it's been reversed by Partai Aceh, so it's now 60-40 provincial kabupaten.
Whereas
But-
it's 10 to 90 everywhere else.
Yeah, and the party, just by virtue of its structure and the fact that the districts that are led by GAM people are completely hierarchically looking, especially to Malik Mahmoud as the leader. Even areas where they have technically the power to assign things, basically respond to orders and directives from the top, especially, for example, in terms of contributing a certain amount of funds to the party or to the KPA or whatever. So, and the budget for, I can't remember the total budget for Wali Nangro's office, but they would have to be spending something like 110 million rupiah a day to exhaust the budget that they have set up for the entire Wali Nangro administration. And that includes all this bureaucracy that they've set up underneath it all. And even on the flag, they allocated 40 billion just for dissemination of the flag in the national budget. Now, the Ministry of Home Affairs in Bappenas, or the Audit Fund, BPK, have actually rejected the provincial budget on more grounds than any other provincial budget has ever been questioned. And they've sent it back saying that it's got to be redone, and some of these provisions have been in question. So it's not clear how much how much is going to survive. But even there, even when they eliminate line items, Party Aceh can fudge a line item, or the provincial government can fudge a line item. So maybe they won't say 12 billion or 120 billion for the KPA, but in effect, you can get a line item on agricultural development and have all that money still go to the KPA because of the way they're working. So I think there is some ability of Jakarta to respond on money, and there's certainly a lot of money that's flowing directly from the central government. But it's also not in the central government's interest to have a fight with the people running the Acehese government. Why? Look at those 92.3% figures for the elections. A, they want the votes, and B, it's one of the only parts of SPY's legacy that he can say, I did this. So the last thing he wants is to alienate the people that he signed an agreement with. And if you look at the accomplishments of the Yudhoyono administration, the Aceh peace agreement is the crown jewel.
Just underlining the unintended tension, I'd like to hear your comments about the Sharia thing as the politicization of identity. I see that some of the people, mostly the ulamas and some other people who use this jargonese on Sharia, whatever, kind of fed up and taking the path of unconventional politics in a way that they took up these issues and make it another identity for the Acehese. Fed up with the tensions between the conventional form of politics with PA and Jakarta. So I was just wondering how, PA has been silent about any controversies on Sharia since Irwandi until now. Well, Irwandi said something about that, but doesn't really taking it seriously and do some follow-up actions on that. But Musakir and Zaini, eventually they haven't said anything on that, even though international exposure is now taking up these issues very seriously.
Yeah, it's an interesting question because GAM, as it was in its incarnation just before the peace agreement, was a very secular organization, basically. And Irwandi was certainly very secular. Zaini is very secular. And many people, let alone Malik Mahmoud. In fact, one of the questions that was raised by the Wali Nangro bill is that it's the only part of the entire structure where the key individual is not required to read the Quran, to be able to read the Quran, because Malik Mahmoud can't. All other people running for public office now have to be able to demonstrate that they can read the Quran, but this was not a requirement of the office. However, there are, the Sharia cuts across all political divisions, so that you get some of the locally elected bupatis or deputy bupatis who have implemented some of these really hard-line regulations. Isn't the mayor of Oksanawe the Partai Aceh guy? And he was the guy that tried to promote this thing about women not riding straddling motorcycles. So you get some parts of the party who are taking a hardline position. On the other hand, you have a lot of people in the party who wouldn't be unhappy to have a cutback on the Sharia legislation, but you're not going to get any rollback politically. I think the best you can get is lack of interest in promoting it any further. But we also had, before the 2009 elections, as a way of trying to reduce the credibility of GOM more generally, you actually did have an intelligence effort to try and question Irwandi's commitment to Sharia by suggesting that he was allowing Christianization by setting regulations allowing the establishment of churches in Aceh, and it turned out to be a complete propaganda effort. So you have some people in GOM who are willing to use Sharia, but it's not a policy of Partai Aceh more generally. You have some intelligence side that are trying to use Sharia to discredit parts of GOM that aren't willing to support it, and you have lots of different interests involved. So I don't think it cuts. I don't think Partai Aceh as a whole has taken a specific position, and as you say, they've been quiet. They've been fairly quiet on the issue.
Thank you for that presentation. I read an article in Aceh Post recently. The head of the local legislature said in the president they are going to set up a kind of referendum to all the Aceh people, simply asking that this is the majority of Aceh people want about the flag. So do you think that is he playing around the language, just threatening the Jakarta people?
The person who said that was Adnan Barancha, who shoots his mouth off on everything. And I don't think the fact that he said there would be a referendum on the flag is necessarily an indication that that will actually happen. I actually think it's more likely that that they will continue to say we have to have the flag. They won't capitulate. Jakarta will, the Dalam Negeri will say the Qanun has to be revoked. And then Partai Aceh or the provincial government will go to the Supreme Court and ask for a ruling. And if they're lucky, they can delay this until after the 2004. They can keep it going legally until after the 2014 election. That's what I think would be the most logical. But I don't really think they would go ahead and hold a referendum, which is an interesting case because, as I said, they could pass a qanun about a referendum. They've got the power to do that, but it's not in their interest right now to clash to the point of a breaking point with Jakarta. Why? Because they also want to take part in the 2014 elections. They're in a position where you're going to expand, because Aceh is now past the 5 million mark, or at least it has according to Partai Aceh, and therefore it can expand the legislature from 69 to 81 seats. That's even more scope for patronage for Partai Aceh in general. So there's an imperative to stay engaged in the political system because it means more resources. It's in nobody's interest to bring it to an actual boiling point where Jakarta is forced to send in troops to arrest Partai Aceh leaders. That's not going to happen. But I think the compromise won't be a referendum. I think the compromise will be stretching it out in the courts for as long as they can.
Okay, thank you, Sidney, for your presentation. I just have one very quick question, actually. If the government in Jakarta, at the end, they will evaluate the negotiation, let us show if we have only two candidates, between Prabowo and Jokowi. Okay. Who do you think of these two candidates will likely to evaluate the negotiation? Because as we know, that Prabowo with his machine, Gerindra, is also trying to get sympathy from Aceh. And as you know, also Muzaki Manaf and all his staff is also become board of advisory for Gerindra in Banda Aceh.
Yeah.
So I think this is also the way of how Partai Aceh is trying to affiliate with the prospective president, you know, which is Prabowo in this case. Like you mentioned, in the election 2009, Partai Aceh, they affiliate with Democrat. But in this coming election, they will affiliate with Gerindra.
Yeah, it's actually a very interesting point. They have affiliated with Gerindra, and everybody was asking why. And the most logical answer is, A, they want Hashim's money for the electoral campaign. B, they want to be affiliated with the winner because that can get them, you know, at a time when, I mean, I think they made the affiliation before Marcus's prediction was coming to conclusion. Secondly, some people say Prabowo has interest in Aceh that he wants to protect, and therefore he wanted to ally with Partai Aceh. And the most, another likely one is that it was in Gerindra's interest, or in Prabowo's personal interest, to ally with Partai Aceh because it was symbolically important with all of the bad vibes about and the bad publicity about human rights violations and so on. If Prabowo could say, well, I have, not only do I have all the people that I disappeared on my staff, but I also have Aceh and he's also done a lot of campaign work in Papua, that symbolically that would give him standing in the elections, even though there are only 13 legislative seats in Aceh altogether. So he's not going to win or lose the election on whether he has Partai Aceh support. But it's interesting to think through what the political calculations were, both at Prabowo and for Partai Aceh in making that alliance. And Partai Aceh people are saying, well, we just want to show that we love the enemy, nothing about money. And that's why we joined forces with Sunarko, the former regional commander in 2009. And Sunarko and a couple of other ex-military guys are still on their team success for 2014.
John.
Thanks, Sidney, for interesting discussion there, presentation. It's rather a gloomy one, especially if you put in, together with this, the story of Aceh's forest, where millions of hectares now being given over to road construction, mining and forests, and logging. There seems to be three parts of the natural resource story that fit in with your story. First, the patronage politics and the self-enrichment, which is a long story in Aceh. Secondly, the poor government. And thirdly, the struggle with Jakarta. All those elements seem to come to play in the natural resource scenario. I was just wondering whether you could say a little bit more about that and whether there are any prospects of saving Aceh's incredible natural heritage.
But it's interesting that Zaini was just basically called to a meeting by the Norwegians and contributed all of this money for red and carbon trading and so on in Indonesia. And Zaini said at the conclusion of this meeting that I'm not really giving away 1.2 million hectares of forest or whatever the figure was. It was over 1 million hectares that he's been reputed to have signed away. It's a much smaller number, and it's only to build roads in central Aceh because we have to end the isolation of our people. Now this would all take place in largely Gayo areas as well in central Aceh. So he was telling the Norwegians that it was a far smaller figure than actually had been reported, and it was all in the interest of development. Well, nothing this government has done and nothing that the Party Aceh legislators have done, even before the governor was elected, shows any real concern with raising the level of welfare of the people in Central Aceh more generally. So I think the resources really is an issue. Now, to be fair, Irwandi was also giving away mining licenses right and left in Aceh, despite having a moratorium, an announced moratorium on logging. So I think there's real cause for concern about what's going to happen to natural resources in Aceh.
Not much scope for doing much about it, really kind of doing constellation as well.
No, because are the lobbying forces to go against it? The most useful NGOs right now in Aceh are the anti-corruption NGOs that are trying to publicize some of the, just in some cases, unbelievable behavior of some of the DPR members, the provincial parliamentary members, and so on. So far, I don't think we've had, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think we've had any KTK prosecutions in Aceh at all.
No.
Yeah.
My question is related to Jakarta's strategy of encouraging radicalism in Aceh. I was wondering if it's just Jakarta's encouragement of the idea of radicalism itself, or are there certain groups that Jakarta actually?
I don't want to be misquoted on this because it's I don't have there are two pieces of hard evidence. One is this propaganda effort against Irwandi before the 2009 elections. One is the assistance that was given to Party Dawah Aceh, one of the small local parties that didn't do very well in 2009. But it's more for the sudden appearance post-tsunami of FPI, which is now much stronger in Aceh than it was before. Where is its funding coming from? I don't know. Also, Hizb ut-Tahrir was never in Aceh before the tsunami. It's all over Aceh now, with a very strong presence, particularly at Malik Saleh University and they call the EIN Shakwala in Banda Aceh now. And I talk to the Hizb ut-Tahrir guys from time to time, and they've just got lots of sources in Aceh from military sources. So it's completely circumstantial. But if you look at how the military saw Laskar Jihad in Ambon as a way of fighting Christian separatists, if you look at some of the ways in which Kisti and others were used in '98 and so on, there's a long story going back there. And it's not out of the realm of possibility that in looking for how to counter what some people on the security side are still deeply convinced remains a pro-independence institution, it's not hard to see that the thought patterns going, well, how do we counter separatist sentiment in Aceh by doing something which actually most Achenese would be completely antipathetic to, because most Achenese, in fact all Achenese that I know, are completely opposed to these kinds of radical networks, but they are making more headway in Aceh than ever before.
Maybe I have a question as well. So if you have one-party states, there are various ways for these parties to stay in power. You either spend patronage, or you provide strong economic growth, so you maintain the popularity and then you win elections, or you simply establish a police state and you rule with intimidation. Now, you said that basically there's no evidence for economic growth. There doesn't seem to be a lot of benefits for the population. So how will Party Aceh in the future ensure that it remains as popular as it is? Is it largely intimidation that sensitive issue.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's clear that there was serious intimidation in the 2012 election for governor, as there was in the earlier elections, although I don't think you can explain the size of the victory on the basis of intimidation. I think that there are a lot of people in Aceh, particularly in rural areas, who did buy the idea that if you don't vote for Partai Aceh, it's us or conflict. And that was a very powerful pull. One question is, will that diminish over time? And I think it could go either way. In some ways, I think if it begins to, if the idea of Aceh as the idea of Partai Aceh as being the alternative to conflict diminishes, that would presumably increase the need for more intimidation as you go into other elections. But Ed can talk about the power of the emotional power of rallying people around the flag and the idea that it's this party that somehow represents the struggle. We were involved in the past, and we represent an authentic Achenese voice. But I also think control of these institutions is another way that you can keep the machine going for the next several elections, even if there's growing disillusionment or disappointment. Also, you've got such lousy alternatives. I don't know, do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, I was thinking along similar lines as you were speaking of this. I mean, in a way, I think it's a good thing that they do have these documents. It does reflect a lot of very real popular support that they do have, despite the intimidation and so on. But in a way, I mean, I think it's a positive thing that they're joining this government and are being tested, because that's the only way that Aceh will be able to emerge at some point into a new form of politics down the track.
Yeah, and it's also interesting to think about what the alternatives were at the time that Partai Aceh was drawn in, because it's certainly clear that ending the conflict was the most important thing to accomplish. And the only way you could accomplish it was by bringing the rebels into the system somehow. It's actually an issue that now the MILF is facing with the Philippines government, is there, how much do you have to concede to the MILF in terms of its political control in order to ensure that they sign on to the peace agreement? And if you look at some of the Latin American cases, there was a period of kind of thuggery and poor governance before eventually a more stable system emerges, even though that was at a local level and not at a provincial level. But one of the things I try to think about is, was there any way to put safeguards into the system? If you're thinking even about Papua or about other conflicts, was there any way to build in safeguards that could have produced more checks on Partai Aceh than you have now? Did we have to end up with this amount of concentrated control? And I think there was, I mean, maybe this is just hindsight, but there was a point at which we had all these international donors providing assistance, and all of it was going, or a lot of it was going to trying to support reintegration of party building and facilitating training of GOM guys to how to build a party and things like that. And there was very little attention to the actual government structure, the non-GOM government structure in Aceh. So if you're trying to think through an aid program for an immediate post-conflict program, is there a way that you can both guarantee that you give the combatants a stake in the system, but also ensure that some kind of institutional checks are built at the same time? I don't know what the answer to that is. But I also think, I still think it's going to be very difficult to dislodge this party, even when it's clear that they are not delivering.
I'd like to ask a short question about how do you see the Indonesia election, the competition
SLF has much influence one way or the other. So I don't think that's, you don't need to worry about that very much. Parti National Aceh, PNA, is more interesting because it's the party Irwandi set up as a way of both giving a vehicle for himself, but also trying to challenge Parti Aceh by drawing in former GAM members. And one of its leaders now is Muksalmina, the former Aceh Besar commander, or figure. But I must say, you go into the PNA office, it's deserted. There's no activity there. And Parti Aceh is just humming. I mean, there's just so much activity going on there. Also, I don't know, if I had been PNA and I wanted to challenge Parti Aceh, even symbolically, I would have chosen a flag that had red, black, and white in some new combination that was manipulating the same kinds of symbols. They came up with this orange flag that looks like a Dunkin' Donuts flag. You know, it gives you no, you know, just even talking with some of the individuals involved gives you no hope at all that this is going to become a viable alternative in any way.
Did you tell it to Irwandi?
Actually, somebody told them that I said it looked like a Dunkin' Donuts flag.
Hi, just on the point of why it matters, you were drawing a few comparisons between Aceh and Papua, and particularly, I suppose, with flag, others. And I guess the implication there is that Jakarta has to be consistent in its policies and what it does in Aceh to what it does in Papua. But of course, it doesn't in that way, I'm sure.
No, I don't think it has to be consistent, but I think everything that happens in Aceh has ramifications for Papua and vice versa. So when you had the MRP formed in Papua and when it was being discussed, there were, you know, it had ramifications back to what does this mean for the Wali Nangro. So there was a connection there. When you had local parties allowed under the Helsinki Agreement, even though there were supposed to be local parties allowed in the 2001 autonomy legislation for Papua, they all had to be according to national legislation. So instantly you began to have Papuans saying, well, if Aceh can get that, why can't we? So there's a synergy back and forth that takes place. So if it's not so much that Jakarta has to be consistent. It's not and never will be. But it's that within the Papuan community, there are major implications for how it will mobilize if it sees Jakarta, if it sees Aceh being allowed to use the GAM flag. I mean, wouldn't you be angrier if we had all these people in jail for flying the Papuan flag? Because it was Papuan anger over that regulation number 77 that you know, was really one of the galvanizing forces when that came out. It was probably the most unpopular pieces of legislation after the 2003 division of Aceh. And there was that much anger in Papua created. So if Aceh gets the flag for, and I don't think it will, but if it did, then the sense of injustice in Papua would just be that much higher.
Thank you, Sidney. You mentioned Mindanao, so I'd like to pick up that comparison just a little bit. Fully accepting your basic premise about why it matters, the dangers of the one-party state in Aceh. If we think about a post-conflict Mindanao, it seems like we would be very happy if there were the coherence of a party in a larger national context of very weak political parties and party structures. From the Mindanao standpoint, one of the great complicating factors is the strength of the clans and the fissurous elements that already exist and that could continue to be very strong in the Bangsamoro entity. So in that sense, aren't there some virtues in a way that you have the coherence of a party in Aceh relative to the chaos of clans?
I think I think you're obviously posing two alternatives, which aren't the only alternatives
Fair
that you
enough.
could have there. I mean, one of the questions that people have asked, I've asked of some of the MILF guys is can you kind of elaborate on the kind of state that you would actually like? How would Sharia courts work, for example, or how would the police actually work? And not only do they not want to have that discussion, they say, and it's probably a fair point, that nobody ever asked Fretlin what kind of state it was going to set up. Nobody asked, the Southern Sudan what kind of state it was going to set up. And they can give you, as you know, 40 different examples of places where they were never asked about what kind of state they were going to set up. And actually, with all the donor money now pouring into Mindanao, I think it's critical that those questions be asked. And I think that it's not so much a question of wouldn't it be better to have a one-party state than all the different clans, but it's more, isn't now the time to be thinking about how you're going to build institutions in this state in a way that actually facilitates post-conflict construction, and that's what I think maybe the lesson is here.
Yeah, Sidney, thanks very much for your presentation. Very interesting. Briefly, I think you might have kind of covered on it, but just to keep that more detail, what's the relationship like between Papua and the other security solution, TNI, in Aceh and Aceh?
They reached a nadir prior to the 2012 elections, and it's interesting why. Up to that point, it was kind of usual police-military relationship, not great, but manageable. But there had actually been some kind of agreement. I don't know the details of this, like an informal agreement before even the campaign began in 2011, that there'd be a division of labor, and that the regional military commander would kind of try to get close to the Irwandi camp, and the police commander would kind of try to get close to so that they would have a real good feel for what was going on at a time when both security agencies were convinced that there was going to be serious trouble. What happened was the police commander got completely co-opted by Party Aceh, and to the point where when all that violence was taking place in Aceh in late 2011 and early 2012, there's some evidence of police collusion there. Now, after that guy, whose name I forget, the police commander left office, it's pretty much back to the normal, not great relationships, but not that bad either. So I think my sense is from talking to some police and military in Jakarta, I haven't talked to them in Aceh recently, that there is concern about the strength of Party Aceh in the area, to the point where I recently read a lecture by some senior police commander who was saying one of the things we should conclude about Aceh is that we gave too many concessions to GAM, which I think is an unfortunate conclusion to draw.
Yeah, I just wanted to push you on the point that Paul was making, because it is the case, isn't it, that the monolithic control exercised by the party and by KPA in particular has delivered something that's quite important, and that is, and pretty much, a pretty remarkable absence of significant post-conflict violence. I mean, okay, we know there's been quite a lot, but when you think about it, I mean, with the localized command structure, I mean, the potential for warlordism of the sort that could get really nasty is quite high, and so in many ways, the most remarkable thing about the Aceh peace process is not, in fact, the deal that was struck, but how well it's worked and how well it's operated, and a big part of that has got to be this ability of government to maintain its coherence maintain this kind of vertical hierarchy and to discipline these people who are sort of kind of often quite crazy in the field and still do believe in independence of life. So that we've never seen that there have been incidents that they've never, kind of snowballed. And so, there is a dilemma here that, I don't know, I kind of get a sense that you are very critical of the outcome, but there are sort of trade-offs that are being made.
But I guess the question I have is, aren't we also failing to call Parte Aceh's bluff? And wasn't there enough support in Aceh for the peace process more generally that, in fact, you could have had alternatives to Parte Aceh that would have still enabled the peace process to last? That Parte Aceh succeeded too much in convincing people that if they weren't involved, for example, if they didn't participate in the 2012 elections, that would mean a return to conflict. I think there was already too much stake. I mean, we had this conversation before, but I think there was already too much stake in the process to fear that if Parte Aceh's bluff was called, that they would simply that they would either result in a completely illegitimate government, or they would somehow find a way of returning to conflict. So I think, again, I think there are ways that you could have had more checks built into the system, or at least experimented with more checks without capitulating to Parte Aceh every time. And we're still, I think we're still, this may be the first time we're actually going to see somebody standing up to them.
Yeah, probably on an issue which maybe they shouldn't stand.
Yeah. But the other thing that worries me, I guess, is that we're also seeing the increased institutionalization of two completely unaccountable institutions, KPA and the Wali Nangro now. And I'm not convinced that it was harder to deal with the KPA, but the Wali Nangro issue is actually divisive. I mean, I don't think that's providing any kind of unifying force in Aceh more generally. So, I completely buy the idea, in your contracting article, that was a very important short-term measure to have, lots of money going to commanders and provided a sense of stability in the short term. But how long does the one party go on? And how much do you have to concede in terms of control before you say that it's time to democratize more?
But Sidney, that's quite interesting as on the local community-based people. How do you see if the Achenese is quite, we call it patriarchy community? I don't care who is the governor, as long as I get the money during the campaign. That's it. Because anyway, I will not get anything in the future. So you mentioned before that Partai Aceh now might be gaining the money from contractors or whatever. In this case, that they will put all resources for the next election.
No, see, I don't think the reason people voted for Parte Aceh was because of money. Because the people that are getting the money are the Parte Aceh elite, not the rest. I think people voted for the party because of this idea that they contributed to the struggle, and without us there would be conflict. I think that's the overwhelming message that was delivered.
What about the issue 1 million per month per household?
Well, it never happened, right? Yeah.
Isn't the real tragedy though about this? I mean, I don't really quite, I'm not sure I agree with it, because we did a food security survey with the University of Kuala last year. We found between 40 and 50% of people in the villages where we were surveying had various degrees of food security ranging to quite severe. And people were breaking down and crying when we were asking questions. And the Archinese state is doing virtually nothing to really deal with that. From my perspective, it's a tragedy. Here's the opportunity of Aceh after so many years. They've got all this funding, and they're wasting all the money on the, at least to use Ross's example, Suharto, for all his problems, he actually did something for a lot of poor people. You know, there were a lot of problems with that, but the Archinese state is really failing, I think. Maybe it's I think that's a tragedy. That's why it does matter, because they're not delivering developmental outcomes. And Aceh really needs it.
Yeah, yeah. Also, it's interesting to talk to some business people who are going out to Aceh to try and invest, because the person they have to talk to is Malik Mahmoud, not Zaidi. It's not the elected government.
I see more of a tragedy, really. And then you've got the forest going that as well.
Yeah.
And that could be cut down on almost scale, if you will, let's say.
Can you say a bit more about those districts, those Kabupaten that are not GUM or Pate Aceh strongholds? Are they part of that one-party state? Do we find different power structures? You know, does the KPA play a role?
Yeah.
And these movements towards two new provinces, what's your assessment on that? Are these partly Jakarta driven, partly elite driven, or do you see a genuine movement away from Banda Aceh and really the belief that if we have a Banda Aceh-led one-party state, we need to separate from the province?
I think the non-Party Aceh controlled districts vary considerably. You've got some that are controlled by people that are actively hostile toward Party Aceh, particularly in the central and southeastern part of Aceh, southwestern part of Aceh. You've got Banda Aceh, which obviously, Banda Aceh had one of the best administrators in Indonesia, let alone in Aceh, a Party Democrat guy. It was much more cosmopolitan, always was, than a lot of the rest of Aceh. But even in some of the areas that weren't controlled by Party Aceh, there was actually a significant vote for Party Aceh, meaning that there was also a significant role for the KPA in those areas. And that I would include parts of Gayun Lues, for example, where there was a very strong Party Aceh presence. Parts of Aceh Barat, which I don't think now doesn't have a GAM party, but there was certainly a very strong presence there. And certainly Irwandi's network also extended to Aceh Besar and Aceh Barat. So I think some of the side effects of this kind of party control extend even to the provinces that aren't under direct Party Aceh administration. I think in terms of Allah and Abbas, these two provinces that could be, I am convinced that there is genuine popular support, particularly in Menor Meriah and Aceh Tengah, for a Gayo province. I mean, I think, but there also is manipulation from Jakarta on this. And I think if it were left to the devices of just the popular movement, they probably wouldn't succeed. Because I think the commitment to Aceh in its current borders is vast and goes far beyond anything that Party Aceh wanted to do. I think the idea of that Aceh is something that would make the resistance to division even greater in Aceh than it was in Papua maybe in 2003. So it would be an extremely unpopular move. I just think that if there was some kind of decision taken in Jakarta, that now was the time to kind of really push forward with this concern over the growing power of Party Aceh, that this could actually lead to clashes in a way that is easily avoided and completely unnecessary. And it has an ethnic dimension, clearly, because you're dealing with the non-Achenese ethnic parts of Aceh.
And it would be a clear violation of Helsinki.
Yeah.
All right, I think we have come to the end of this fantastic session, so please join me in thanking Sidney Jones for her last performance as an ICG representative at the AG.